it's a pleasure today to be joining you on what is really such a fascinating topic that we're joined with someone whom I consider the leader of innovation in product, in strategy, in actually driving this agenda vision. So I'll give a quick introduction to Colleen, and then we'll take it from there. So Colleen Tyner is the SVP of product, and she also runs strategy at Beeline. She's a visionary executive specializing in human capital management technologies. She leads Beeline's business, product, and partnership strategy, really focusing on identifying and assessing the needs, the development of new solutions, and at the end of the day, the value creation to achieve these goals of that extended workforce, which we'll be talking much more about. Personally can say that Colleen is one of the most innovative leaders I've ever met. So really thrilled to have her here today presenting to this RAC group as a first-time RACer. And without further ado, we'll just kick off with questions. Sound good?
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Great. So Colleen, what is a VMS?
The toughest question first. Thank you, Athena, for inviting me to. It's always interesting when I get a chance to chat with people in the HR side, especially now, since so many of my customers are coming to me with their HR partners from extended workforce and HR together with a lot of questions. So I appreciate being here. The VMS, it's actually an acronym because our industries love acronyms, and it stands for Vendor Management System. It's quite outdated. I think Beeline outgrew it years ago, but unfortunately, again, because we like acronyms, we're slow to find a better term. People are creatures of habit. So it stands for Vendor Management System. I think the reality is it's evolved to extended workforce management platform is probably a more accurate representation. And someday we'll drop the VMS. I think it's important to know it really started, and I know there was some other talk about Y2K on some of the other sessions. 2 decades ago, actually, in Y2K, companies needed to manage their IT suppliers, which is hence the vendor moniker, and their contractors at scale, because there was so much activity in the extended workforce, and probably the right word is outrageously inflated margins that were being charged at that time really needed to be reined in. It was a massive cost problem. And then there was also the driver for putting cost controls and centralizing processes, because that's also when there was a massive software company that had a co-employment settlement upwards of $97 million. So that was sort of the, I think, times of adversity and uncertainty drive innovation, and that's sort of where VMS was born. Today, the VMS, as I mentioned, is not so vendor-centric as it is people-centric, spans every type of worker, scientists working on vaccine research, engineers doing designing airplanes, or the grounds crew for airlines, undersea welders, believe it or not, for oil companies, warehouse workers and drivers for logistics companies, high-end management consultants, you name it. It's all under extended workforce now.
So Colleen, I think it's an interesting call out that you mentioned your world, which was probably previously finance folks, procurement folks, maybe legal folks, were that ecosystem, and the influx of HR leaders, talent leaders into RFPs, into opinions about product roadmaps and visions, and into innovation schedules and rollouts. I'd love if you could maybe just talk about sitting at kind of the forefront of that, this convergence of talent acquisition with contingent talent. What are you seeing from the innovators? What are some of those trends that either some of the innovators here joining us or those thinking forward of what to expect and what to plan for over the next 1 to 4 years? Why is that happening, and what's driving this convergence?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. And it's funny, I just ended a call with one of those companies, And what I would say is, I think we're with this characteristic, I think we're reaching almost the end of the innovator part of the curve, and it's nearing sort of mainstream decisioning. And that is oversight, at least goal alignment, if not organizational alignment, to when it comes to talent, to be including both full-time and extended workforce. It's been surprising to me, the surge of that. You know, we saw that building throughout, really before 2020, but definitely during 2020, and a lot of it, again, you know, adversity drives a lot of innovation and new behaviors, in innovation, not just in technology, but in organizational models. So I would say those that are carving the path, you know, if you will, are focusing on outcomes. What are the priorities, and are able to pivot on those outcomes very quickly when something important sort of causes their strategy to shift, and have less of a hard line between perm and flex workforce management. Definitely still separate systems. You know, there's lots around co-employment. It's the reason they were separated in the first place, but that doesn't mean they shouldn't have complementary strategies, visions, goals, et cetera. And so I would say that's probably the single most important thing that those innovators have in common, is they are organizationally, structurally changing to look at the total workforce more holistically, for sure.
Yeah. It's fascinating, I think, when you've been at kind of that front seat to see that the definition of who is in that extended workforce shift from maybe supplemental, non-core, non-strategic talent in the early days, where it was just a matter of cost and scale up, scale down, to, as you mentioned, vaccine scientists and, you know, people building the airplane intelligence systems, and data science talent that you could never hire internally, but they'll do fascinating projects for you, right?
Okay.
So I'd love, I think, just to cover for this group and for everyone joining us, we love a discussion, so feel free to chat and ask questions that you have on the chat. But how would you describe the most critical talent problems that the orgs that you work with are facing, that they're rethinking who is in that extended workforce, or they're solving problems that they can't solve with perm labor or internal labor with that extended workforce? Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, going back to having those common objectives and common goals and focusing on outcomes, both in HR and contingent, whether it's in procurement or IT, having that partnership, or even the organizational alignment, I think is critical. And you know, I speak with about 10 of our leading customers on a weekly basis, because it just, you know, it allows me to sort of synthesize multiple points of view. And there are absolutely two trends, I would call them macro factors, that are affecting all of them, regardless of what product they deliver or service they provide. You know, and it really spans the gamut. And that really is this perfect storm of talent challenges that are, and it's companies that are facing it, and also the agencies, when you think about extended workforce, that are facing the same challenges. So, it all boils down to supply and demand. So competition for talent, we can't take lightly. And as we've done our research and watched how our business has been affected by COVID, for instance, and is a reflection of how all the customers that we serve are affected by COVID, what we're seeing is that competition is actually intensifying and will continue to. And we dug into that. Why? Because we thought it would go in the other direction. We'd have to have this, you know, this wait out to see what happens. And why was there this surge in competition when it was already really intense? And it's because there's been a permanent and sustainable shift overnight, in addition to already being an intense sort of market for talent, right? It being a talent market. And that's that competition for talent has no borders. So companies, small and large, even companies our size, Athena, as well as the companies that have tens of thousands of employees, are all competing on, don't know if we lost Athena or not, but are all competing on a global scale. Talent has a choice. Hopefully she comes back like never before. I'll keep going for you guys and share some thoughts. So that's one is the boundaries being gone. The other piece of it is the complexity of the demand. And I'm curious, and definitely put in the chat if this resonates with you, because I'm always I'm a listener at heart. I'd like to hear what you're going through as well. But the demographic shift we're hearing we have 5 generations that are actively in the workforce right now. Whether it's full-time or not doesn't matter. And the largest population of that active workforce is actively retiring. So companies are dealing, and this goes back to the perfect storm, with their day-to-day operating needs that are fluctuating based on everything that's going on in the world today, plus the needs for, we see you now, Athena, plus the needs for skills that are being opened up in larger volumes by retired workers, right? Skills that we've taken for granted for 10 and 15 years are now needing to be filled. Plus there's new needs driven by all this innovation and growth strategies that are new skills that are needed. So there's this kind of perfect storm of this global competitive landscape for talent like we've never seen before. And this, shift in demand that it couldn't come at kind of like a worse time, both of those happening at the same time. So in my head, it's a perfect storm, and I'm hearing it with every company that I speak with. And I'm curious for those of you on the call, if that's something you're worried about, if that keeps you up at night as well.
Hopefully I'm back. Don't know why I cut out there. Just some New York City internet. But yeah, so those attending, feel free to write in the chat. Would love, obviously, your questions or your thoughts, or maybe the challenges you're having in helping the org shift. Maybe it's hiring managers or recruiters. If you have the option of a perm or a flex resource, how do you reshuffle from the norm of always going perm, always going FTE, when you have that option, and going flex, and for what urgency of speed or really hard to find skills, or what types of talent? Colleen, I actually think it'd be great if you could maybe talk a little bit more on that topic about, the innovators that have broken the silos that are traditionally extended workforce and perm workforce, right? What have you seen make possible? And I know you work with some amazing leaders that have the vision, the foresight, probably the executive mandate to make that a holistic end-to-end workforce that doesn't start or stop in such siloed places. So I think if you could maybe even talk about what have you seen that enables them to do that, and what's kind of the impacts that's driven to their businesses.
Yeah, I'm absolutely happy to share. And I think what's important to know is I'm an observer of success when it comes to these companies. I have the benefit of having these relationships where I get to learn what companies are doing. So these aren't my things. I would say these are what I've seen and what I've observed from the clients I've seen be most successful. So I think it boils down to a handful of things. So there's structure, and I mentioned that earlier. Focusing on outcomes often causes structural change, whether that structural change is formality around the alignment of goals between perm and flex, or permanent, contingent, and HR, however you want to phrase that, or it's a physical shift or reorg. And I can't tell you how often I'm seeing that now. It's really surprising to me, and it really started in earnest March, April timeframe, and it amazed me, because I think large, Fortune 500 companies are difficult to move quickly in terms of change management, and I've been seeing them do it. And so it's the structure change is definitely something that I've noticed and observed. I think the other is, and you mentioned this a little bit, Athena, is the people themselves and the training skills and activities that recruiters are doing. So instead of reactively responding, almost like an order taker to HR managers, I'm seeing these teams of advisors spin up. And there's one company in particular that just, I think, has just nailed this. And they're using recruiters holistically across perm and flex to fill positions, but as an advisor. So they can say they have the data, they have the tools. You have to have those to be efficient because there are too many systems within most, IT and HR programs. So you have to have the data and tools, but they're using those to maximize the time of those recruiters and have them focusing on helping, especially with strategic roles, managers understand the trade-off between time, cost, and quality. Flex, if you're going flex, outsource or agency temp or offshore and all of those things. So these white glove almost programs that are doing more with less essentially in today's market because they're using technology to do so, and just upskilling people into that advisory role. So I think that's a big shift and a commonality amongst what I would say these innovators fall into. Systems is another one. So, and we might talk, I think we are going to talk about this, but total talent will come up. And when I say systems, I do not mean smash together everything in one technology. I think there's lots of reasons not to do that. Compliance, risk, all of those being valid ones, as well as change management and all that goes with that. But most of these companies have fit for purpose solutions for the strategic aspects of their workforce. So there's your full-time side and your non-employee side. Your non-employee management systems should be as sophisticated as your full-time, if not in some cases more so, because there's so much complexity around managing things like rates and cost allocations and billing that's not necessarily the same thing on the employee side. So having fit for purpose systems in place is key. So I equate this to having all the acronyms. So you have the ATS, the CRM, the HCM, the VMS, the P2P. It blows me away how many acronyms we have. I wish someday we could change that, because anyone coming new into our industry, these college students, they don't have a chance. But they really start taking advantage of, because they have those systems and they maximize the talent that is in those systems and it's closest to them, and is already known, they're able to respond faster by maximizing the data they have. I really think the future of workforce technology is similar to that of marketing automation, in that it sort of wrangles in all the leads, all the talent that you have already at your disposal, and let it leaking out of your organization and going over to your competitor. So I'm passionate about that one. The last one was their processes. I think in the past, and I don't, there's a lot of HR people on the call, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that co-employment is a valid risk concern. Some people have, it's almost a polar opposite points of view on it. A lot of companies who have very low risk tolerance, this is a major issue, and processes can influence that. But I think if we take a step back, and companies that look at, and there's a handful of our customer base that I talk to, look at very specific processes that are similar among employees and non-employees. And they look at how can we maximize those processes and make them consistent so that we have a good candidate brand, whether it's a candidate brand for contractors or an employer brand for employees. How do we represent ourselves in a way that is consistent with our values, things like that. So talent acquisition is absolutely an area where a holistic view is appropriate and processes make sense. You still need clear delineation of what's contract and permanent, but the customers that I see being wildly successful are posting their contingent work on their careers pages. And yes, when you hit apply, it goes to a different system, but the people attracted to your brand are coming to you for either employment work or contract work. And then compliance is another area, worker compliance. Everyone's audited on worker compliance, if they're over a certain size especially. And it's amazing to me when companies have such varying differences in things like requirements for vetting and background checking and things like that, when the workers are all coming into your building, they're all accessing your systems. So there's an opportunity to create, strategies that are holistic.
Yeah, I think that first, hopefully everyone joining now realizes why I was so excited to have this discussion with Colleen, just a fountain of endless knowledge on this topic. And a lot of the hard questions that organizations are either facing now or will face, that COVID has accelerated with remote first, that hard to find skill sets, that hard to fill roles, even in a COVID unemployment, environment. What is that making you think? Is it going to become more achievable after COVID? Often not for those roles, right? Mm-hmm. So those constraints, I think, are having companies ask a lot of interesting questions, and where other silos were already broken because no one predicted this, that acceleration. So I think that's two interesting questions there, Colleen, for this group, which is one, you mentioned the sophistication requirements of a non-full-time system, right? So I think there's two things that often get lost, which is one, there's not this one size fits all that's going to be able to handle your, extended workforce and your regular workforce, because the attributes of what you need to manage and handle that extended are actually different. In some places overlapping, and in other places different. And then I think that second piece, which is, where do you see, and this is a leading question because we build this together, but how do you see the role of AI and technology accelerating and adding hooks between silos that today struggle, given that the environments of those two workforces need different tools? How do you see technology being able to help what today are manual, friction-filled, challenging process for the human to make that leap between two systems and two very different processes?
Yeah. Okay. That's a lot of questions. Let me think through it. We worked on this, but you added more stuff in there. So I'll go through these in a couple of different, take a couple different roads. I think it all goes back to outcomes and ownership. So, I mentioned a lot about structure already. So let's go more towards mindset and outcomes. When companies are thinking about, or you're sitting in talent acquisition and you're thinking about, contingent work, that's over there. Contingent workforce, that's over there. If you pause for a moment and think about kind of the state that we're in, and consider that there's this concept of project work or contingent work that has a finite start and finish, and it could be filled by employees with a specific skill set versus a contingent worker, or you may have a full-time position that you're just not finding, what you need fast enough, that could be filled by a contingent worker on a convert to perm. And I know those seem like simplistic things, and we all say, yes, we know that. But the challenge is the way that a lot of organizations are structured, the thinking doesn't actually happen. It just, talent acquisition and HR goes down the talent acquisition road, and contingent work says, I have a contingent rec and I'm going down the supplier road. Ne'er the two shall have a conversation. There's conversations at the strategy level, but at the operational level, at the recruiter level, are they sitting next to each other? Having these conversations, focusing on how do we solve this manager's challenge versus how do we fill this rec and fill this need. So I think, as in my conversations with clients, especially those on that innovator curve prior to COVID, we were definitely seeing that shift. I think during and now, it's even more pressing. In fact, it's just a conversation I was having last week with a customer. I was hearing, rather than cutting workforce or cutting hours of pay or furloughing our workers, we're trying to figure out how can we know what these other positions that we need are, whether they're contingent or full-time. How can we know what those are, and which workers have those skills to fill those needs, and shuffle the deck a little bit, as opposed to sort of letting this group go and then finding more here and just kind of using those old processes. So this is where I think I'm getting around to the second part of your question, which is AI and data and technology, and where can it play in? A lot of this has to happen at volume. right? And that's really where AI comes in. And that's really where systems and data comes in, is maximize the systems and the data that you have. There is so much rich data in HCMs, CRMs, your VMS, whatever you're using, that could be maximized if you have the intelligence to understand that, do things like matching skills, not just roles and titles, but looking at skills and competencies, and then pulling that forward to a talent acquisition person, or an advisor that can say, and there's an example where one company that I was talking with, they have service people that are client facing, and they're needing to fill those roles. And so instead of looking out in the market, they were looking at the people that were filling the roles in on-site building services, right? Because they were providing services to their customers, or to their internal customers. Why couldn't they be trained to provide service to their external customers? So that's some of the innovation that we're seeing. It's absolutely technology and AI systems, but it's also innovation and thinking and processes that's really come out. So,
yeah. Well, I'm just watching the chat, and the frictions that actually Colleen and I have been thinking a lot about and discussing a lot is this: how if you were a recruiter or a hiring manager, and for every role or at the point of backfill identification, if you saw internal, external, passive, flex, the full options that you have to you with time and the time to fill with that type and the cost of that type. And, if that was automatically delivered, that recruiter could be the total talent advisor that you dream. But today, when you have to do all that manual work, plus go through all those systems, have access to know what the data in those systems are, it's an impossible mandate. So,
right.
I think it's something you and I share the philosophy of, which is that's on the vendors to help make the human job feasible and possible within that vision of where that company is ready, right?
Absolutely. You can't ask that to be done manually. It would take teams of hundreds of people.
Exactly. And actually another question that got asked, which I love, from Mercy, was, in South Africa, contingent work is synonymous with specialists and consultants who earn premium salaries. And that actually ends up with a huge bill for the org. So they're constantly looking at converting those to FTEs to cut costs. I know this is something you and I discuss a lot, which is you need the right system for the right role, but how can we interoperate? What are you thinking, Colleen, about, flex to perm, or capturing that a flex worker is open to perm in your VMS and being able to move them with the respective controls of the supplier and the fee schedules and the commissions that are needed? And I also think that mentions a really important thing that this group might not know of, which is some of the innovation you're leading is around, passive communities of flexible workers that are open to future work, private talent clouds, and others. So it'd be great if you can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I would say that's kind of the area we see growing the most in the specifically to extended workers is really synonymous to what you have in place most of the time on the full-time side, which is this asset of passive and active candidates that are interested in working with your brand. They may be actively looking. They may be saying, hey, if I might be interested if the right thing came along, in the realm of contingent work. So I that's the fastest area of growth for us that we see the most adoption from clients, outside of reining in that statement of work contingent spend, which is my guess where a lot of that sort of really high premium work happens. And there's absolutely a reason to pay that premium when you're truly getting that management consulting level, high end level work. But contingent really spans the whole gamut, from the gig task worker to to that management consultant and everything in between. So yeah, the talent pipelines are huge. And so imagine that you could, and this is, what Athena and I try to talk about at least once a week. Imagine if you could have a really simple way to just say, hey, what are all of my talent options? Who are the people in my talent pool that could fill this position? Who are the maybe employees that are ready in the succession planning for this next role? Regardless of looking at the talent before looking at the way to engage with the worker, right? Here's all the talent available to me. What's the best way to engage them? Is this strategic? Is it something that I need to keep within the organization? Do I even have budget for it? Should I bring it on as a contingent? Are they interested in contingent? How does this affect my diversity plan? Can I tap into diversity pipelines on contingent or full-time? So yeah, that's absolutely the opportunity that I think that's where we're headed, right? I think that's where most companies are headed. It's a little scary if you're doing everything manually again today, but if you recognize and realize that there are technologies out there that make it possible, it's here and it's possible.
And Colleen, you mentioned what is a really important topic for most of the people on this call, which is diversity and inclusion. And I think, the recognition of someone might desire or need flex work today, perm work tomorrow, and back to flex work if they are, a single working mother going in and out of lockdowns, or if they are a military spouse moving between locations, or, so I think you see a lot of interesting insights into how a hybrid extended plus perm workforce strategy can also help further diversity and inclusion goals, or fill diversity and inclusion gaps, or provide flex to perm visibility, maybe where they don't have that. So maybe a little bit more on that and some of the innovation you're working on to tackle those problems.
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's two topics related to the worker: diversity, absolutely, being one of them, and the other being consent. So I think, for the extended workforce space, we're catching up, right, to the full-time side where, it really is the decade of the people. At this point, I think typically we've treated extended workforce as a procurement IT spend category, which it is, and it's also people, and that's what's most important to us, because that's what's most important to our customers. So in thinking about that, there's a couple of things, and the first is probably the single most talked about subject right now that has the most amount of curiosity, uncertainty, trying to wrap my head around it, sort of sentiment to it right now. And we're working with a lot of clients to address this. And that is, how can I apply my diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies to my extended workforce in a safe and compliant way? And not just safe and compliant from a D&I perspective, but also from a co-employment perspective. There's another dynamic there that HR needs to, and procurement and IT and whoever's involved really needs to be mindful of. So number one, the systems of record for both employee and extended workforce are robust systems. There's no reason to merge those together and sort of toy with that risk profile. However, I think the direction that we're going, the direction that I see a lot of companies going, is that you can maximize that data in those different systems of record. Today, the extended workforce is about 43% of most Fortune 500's total workforce. I mean, that's a significant number. When I talked about 2 decades ago, or even 1 decade ago, it was 20%. So it's growing massively. And as we kind of come out of this decline in workforce due to COVID, we're going to see contingent labor, and it's how it always goes after every sort of decline, economic decline. That contingent workforce is going to grow again, and I'm hearing from clients that it will likely be a sustained growth as opposed to a rapid switch over to full-time like we usually see. And so when you think about DE&I and that 43%, it's not surprising that we should be looking at the extended workforce. Those are the people that are on the video chats, right? So if I'm not counting them and there's a room full of people and they're not really representative in my numbers for my DE and I, am I really making a difference? If I'm only tracking supplier diversity, for instance, like who's a minority or women-owned supplier, I'm leaving this worker diversity concept up to the suppliers. And it's absolutely an engagement for suppliers. It's important that they're involved. But what I'm seeing is companies coming to me and saying, I need to include extended workers in my bias prevention policies and technology that helps prevent bias prevention. How can you help us with that? I'm hearing diversity talent pipelines and how can I maximize them, not just in extended workforce, but how can I use them? And that's a little bit of what we talked about. And then just overall worker diversity and inclusion reporting. How can I safely, without being considered my data because they're not my employees, get worker diversity and inclusion reporting about the extended workforce and my sort of footprint and how I compare to other companies in my markets, in my industry, when it comes to diversity, inclusion, and reporting. And that's something we're really passionate about. I'm hearing every customer ask me, how are we going to solve for this? So I think that's watch that space. It's
stay tuned. Follow that channel.
Exactly. Stay tuned to that channel because it's moving.
So just in our remaining 2 minutes, and so grateful for our audience and the engagement and the chat. And I wish Colleen and I could spend hours, and I wish we could spend hours answering all the great questions that are being raised. Just this last piece, Colleen, because you've heard total talent management more than perhaps anyone else over 2 decades. Your CEO does not like the term total talent management, as I learned. And it's probably the most overused phrase in HR tech today, right? So why do you think now is any different, right?
Yes, I definitely think it's different. And I saw in the comments too, someone asked about talent sharing. And I think this is relevant to that question as well. The reason it's different now is I think there are very specific, tangible, actionable challenges that consistently apply to the total workforce. They've sort of made themselves known. And before total talent management, I think it's been amorphous. It's been sort of a marketing phrase. And that's why my CEO always has to say something about that. But if we stop and stop thinking about it as a thing, right? And start thinking about it as a set of strategies, right? It starts to become, like I said, actionable. So companies that I'm seeing move the needle and frankly, set the tone for where things are going when it comes to total workforce is they are looking at legislation like data privacy protection, GDPR. That applies to all workforce, not just employees. If you have PII data in your extended workforce platform and in your HR systems or anything else, you have to be able to allow those workers to provide consent to collect, use, and store that information. That's a total workforce strategy that you have to address. I think another example is the highly distributed nature of the workforce. We talked about remote work, instant communication technologies for business continuity, for emergency response. The telephone game, having suppliers contact candidates after the fact, it takes too long. So you need to be able to reach out to all workers that are in a building, access to a systems, et cetera, and I want to be mindful of time. And then we talked about D&I. And I think the last thing here is what's really different. Those problems are bubbling and brewing and becoming more important. So that's one ingredient. The second ingredient is the technology. We just weren't there. We weren't there 5 years ago. We were all trying to get there, I think, very quickly. But it's just now that we're there, right? We have the technology. We have the ability to integrate all of those systems. We have the ability to have AI layers on top of them that accelerate those talent advisors' roles. That's really the difference. And so I think it's permanently actually going to happen despite my CEO's phrasing.
Well, thank you all for joining. One of my favorite Colleen quotes is that you can't treat people like pencils. And I think that that's a great way just to end this. That extended workforce is ever more important and critical for a strategy, and how you stitch it together, and what are the systems and what are the processes, how do you have leadership aligned and people aligned, and above all, how can that further your general organization goals. And look forward to continuing to engage with all of you all in this discussion, and grateful for our wonderful host for having us, and Colleen for joining us today.
All right, thank you.